We'd really like to thank Flathead Valley Community College for providing this venue. This debate's also being streamed live on dailyinterlake.com. So just to go over the debate format. Our debate features all three candidates on the ballot in this year's race for Montana's sole seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Each candidate will be asked a question by a panel of three local journalists over here on the end. They will have 90 seconds for an initial response, 60 seconds for a follow-up rebuttal. Answers will be timed, and our timekeepers will hold the placards to let candidates know how much time they have left. When time is up, I'll ask them to move on. We're not going to have any opening statements tonight, but we're going to allow candidates to present a 3-minute concluding statement, and candidates are allowed to use notes throughout the entire debate. We're not going to discourage applause, but we do ask you to please be respectful. Each candidate does deserve a chance to be heard. And at this time, please make sure your cell phone is turned off. So let's introduce the candidates for tonight. Republican Ryan Zinke is a third-generation Montanan. Born in Bozeman, he was raised in Whitefish and graduated from Whitefish High School in 1980. He went on to attend the University of Oregon on a football scholarship and studied geology. He's a retired Navy SEAL officer, where he twice served on SEAL Team 6. He retired from active duty in 2008, and that same year he was elected to the Montana Senate, where he served for 4 years. He's married to his wife Lola. They have a daughter Jennifer and 2 sons, Wolf and Conrad. In the middle, Libertarian Mike Fellows. Born in Lewiston, Idaho, he graduated from Havre High School in 1976 and later earned a bachelor's degree in radio television at the University of Montana. He served in the Army Reserves from 1982 to 83. Currently is self-employed and lives in Missoula. And on the end, Democrat John Lewis, 4th-generation Montanan, born in Billings and raised in both Billings and Missoula. He's a graduate of Missoula Sentinel High School in 1996. He went on to attend Western Washington University, where he studied political science and communications. After college, he worked for Senator Max Baucus, most recently serving as the state director for 4 years. John is married to his wife, Melissa. They have a daughter, Kate, and a son, Jackson. Our debate panel tonight includes 3 local journalists, Carol Marino, Matt Bunk, and Frank Neely. Carol is community editor at the Daily Interlake, where she has worked for the last 12 years. She is also vice president on the board of the Literacy Center for Northwest Montana, and she's on the communications committee for United Way. Matt Bunk is publisher of the Western News and Libby. He's been in the newspaper industry for 15 years, with the majority of his career spent in Phoenix, Arizona, where he focused on coordinating political coverage for newspapers. He's appeared as a political analyst on ABC News, C-SPAN, and National Public Radio. Matt currently serves as vice president of the Montana Newspaper Association. Frank Neely has been managing editor of the Daily Interlake since 2000. He's worked at the newspaper since 1984. He's also worked at the Bismarck Tribune, the Los Angeles Daily News. He lives in Kalispell with his wife and their 3 children. All right, and with that, we're going to begin the debate. First question is going to come from Frank.
Thank you for coming. I wanted to first, on behalf of publisher Rick Weaver, thank you all for attending. Rick is himself attending a conference in Chicago and couldn't be here, but he wanted me to extend his warm welcome. And the first question will be going to Mr. Lewis, followed by Mr. Zinke, and then Mr. Fellows, in that order. Mr. Lewis, in the wake of the entry of Ebola into the United States, the American public appears to be losing confidence in the public health care system, as directed by the Centers for Disease Control and the Obama administration. How can Congress work to restore this confidence, and would you say that Americans' fear of inadequate safeguards is justified or not? Feel free to address CDC procedures, flight restrictions, and use of American troops in Western Africa.
Thank you, Frank. First, I want to thank Daily Interlake and Flathead Valley Community College for hosting, and also our moderator, Matt, and our panel. And thanks to Mr. Fellows and Mr. Zinke for participating. I'm glad we have all three candidates tonight. It's the first time it's been that case since Butte. And throughout this campaign, you've seen two candidates with firm positions on issues, Mr. Fellows and myself. I've released my positions on ideas on everything from agriculture and protecting public lands to cleaning up Congress and wasteful spending. You have a third candidate in Mr. Zinke, who's been the multiple choice candidate in this election. Multiple choice. Chuck Johnson asked the question in the Billings debate a few weeks ago. Which Ryan Zinke are we going to see tonight? The Billings Gazette said it best. It's hard to pin down where he stands on issues. I watched his positions evolve just in the past 24 hours of this race. This morning I read in the Montana Standard that despite previously saying that the Paul Ryan budget was a reasonable framework and wasn't as aggressive as he would like, he doesn't support it anymore. Well, which is it? Strong leadership is knowing where you stand and being consistent in those issues. Now to your question, Frank. The Ebola crisis. We need to make sure we have the strongest public health system possible. And I think this shows several things. Number one, we are falling behind the world in terms of research in this country. We can't even get a Surgeon General approved in the United States Senate. And when you think about our healthcare system, is that a stop? You know? I'll come back to it tonight.
Mr. Zinke?
Well, your answer to your question is this, is that the president, did not appoint a doctor. He appointed a spin doctor. Is that Ebola is a threat. Same thing as ISIS, and I think we have to be firm. Is I think we should quarantine the 3 African states that where Ebola is coming. The number one job of our government is to protect its people, period. Number one job. And when the government fails to do that, then they failed as a government. There's a lot of questions about Ebola. How is it contaminated? How are people contaminated? How does a hospital with hazmat suits, how is that possible that we allow other individuals to fly 5 different cities, maybe exposing another 800? We don't know exactly the 21 days. How did we come up with 21 days? We don't know exactly. I think in this point is that leadership is like telling the truth and look at the problem and fix it. And I don't agree with sending our troops overseas to Africa. Not until they're trained. They have to be trained here. And also, what happens to the mission that the troops had before? So these are important questions. It comes out with truth. And I think number one, quarantine. Number two, get the answers and then move on. Thank you.
Mr. Fellows?
Well, I guess in terms of the Ebola crisis, I guess I really don't support sending our military to some of these different countries to help combat some of those problems, because we've already got a foreign policy disaster in the first place. But I think Ebola, in some cases, is more about education in the United States. A lot of these hospitals aren't really up to snuff, I think, on their isolation procedures. I've been in the healthcare business for a number of years myself, and isolation is pretty important. You got to cap and gown yourself in different situations, whether it's hepatitis or any other kind of disease that can be spread either by air or by fluid bodily contact, and so we need a better containment. So I think it's more of an education issue. The CDC is kind of has been lax on that, and so just spending more money and some of this stuff won't work. We got to change the procedures and change the culture of the hospitals and the corporations as well.
I definitely don't support sending troops to Africa to solve it. And in terms of flight bans, people are going to get into countries if they want to get into countries. And so I don't know that that's the solution. We've got to address the underlying problem here, and that's our healthcare system. There are millions of uninsured Americans in this country, millions that get healthcare. And if we have a giant outbreak of Ebola or what's next, are those people going to get checked for that? We've got to address the underlying problems in this country in terms of our public healthcare system. We've been a leader with our public healthcare system in terms of vaccines for polio, penicillin. Let's get back to that and invest in our public health system and in research. I was just up at the McLaughlin Institute the other day. And they can't get people to go into the program because it cuts to National Institutes of Health. And Americans are leaving the country to do research in places like India where there is funding for that type of research. We've got to fix our public health care system.
Mr. Zinke?
Well, I would say, you know, as far as the NIV, we're spending more money on White House vacations than we are handling. And that's true, look at it. But it is about our border, about our southern border. And it's about making sure that we protect our people. Is that if a 9-year-old child can come across the border, so can ISIS, so can an individual with Ebola. And if you're sick in Africa, where's the best help in the world? United States. So what's to think that you would not want to board a plane and come to the United States, or go to Tijuana, or go to Mexico and come across our border? And so the first job of our government is to protect its citizens. And that's making sure that we shut down our southern border and we have a quarantine of the hot spots in Africa where the central problems come.
Mr. Fellows?
Well, I think we do probably need a plan. We don't have one right now. And like I say, it's better isolation procedures. I mean, you got hospitals in Montana that are able to control the Ebola. St. Patrick's and Missoula Community Hospital is also one that can control the containment. You know, when people do come down with symptoms like the plane that went from Cleveland to Dallas, well, they should have quarantined those folks and kept them for a number of days just to make sure that the disease didn't develop and that they were free. And so those are the kinds of things that we can put in place right now. And if you try to get Congress to do anything, they're not going to do anything because they can't agree on what issues to spend money on.
All right, the next question will come from Carol Marino for Mr. Zinke.
Thank you. And Mr. Zinke will begin, followed by Mr. Fellows and Mr. Lewis third. Mr. Zinke, a large number of breadwinners in the Flathead Valley actually work in the Bakken oil fields in eastern Montana and western North Dakota. What are your energy policies on fracking, oil trains, and CO2? And how would they specifically help Montanans? How do you balance health and environmental concerns into the equation along with economics?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to introduce my wife, Lola's here tonight. So, but I've been very clear on energy policy because the energy policy in this country is our chance. It's our chance to bring back jobs, manufacturing, because the shale play in this country is so incredibly enormous. I'm a former geologist. It wasn't the case when I went to school. They thought we were going to be out of oil absolutely 2 years ago. That's not the case. So the shale play can and will be done correctly. There is not one case of mix. There's 3,000 lawsuits. There's not one case of mix between a frac and an aquifer. Not one case. And it's been looked at by multiple agencies. Doesn't mean you don't stop regulation. You need regulation. But it's a farce to say that there is a problem with fracking, at least the way it's been done up and now. Secondly, energy independence. I don't want to be held hostage anymore to foreign entities. And Montana can have a play in being energy independent and making this country energy independent. And my daughter's a Navy diver, my son-in-law is a Navy SEAL, and I want to see your kids and my kids go to fight on foreign shores for a commodity we have here. Montana has a role to play to make sure we don't repeat the mistakes of the Williston Basin, which we can. We're smarter, we're better. Montana has a better MEPA policy. So I'm an advocate for all the above, but including oil, gas, and coal. Thank you.
Mr. Fellows?
Well, just think on energy independence, some of the regulations that the EPA put out in terms of CO2 gases, really, in terms of what I've read, will have a negligible effect and it will hurt industry. I myself would like to protect more private property rights. That's why I've come out against the Keystone Pipeline, because I think we're going to have trouble with that. And I think even states like Nebraska agree that they don't want the pipeline over some of their aquifer, because if there's a problem that water is going to be undrinkable. It's going to be harm a lot of people. And I've never been one to give all the subsidies to energy companies, including oil and coal, and I think even wind and solar ought to be able to stand on their own. I mean, we've got too many crony capitalists in Washington, D.C. when they decide to pick winners and losers, and then they give $500 million to Solyndra for solar power that failed. I mean, they should have went to the University of Montana Business School and had a better business plan. I think there are some things that we could help in this country in terms of things like industrial hemp, because industrial hemp, it can be used for building materials. We can make fuel out of it. I mean, Henry Ford had the first hemp car, but he got sort of bribed by the oil companies and said, we don't want hemp oil, we want regular oil because we want to make money. So I think there's other ways we can deal with climate change and help our society.
I support an energy policy that truly is all of the above and below. I've called for investing in traditional forms of energy, oil, coal, natural gas. But I've also said we need to look at the long-term future for our kids and our grandkids. And we should invest in those energy sources that we have an abundance of here, right in Montana. I was up in Havre just the other day. Their bioenergy project there. They're doing world-class research to use biomass for energy. And the EPA should classify biomass as a renewable energy source. Let's invest in all forms of energy. In terms of fracking, this is an invention in Texas. It's an incredible development that's going on there and, of course, in Montana and North Dakota. And we need to know what is going in the ground. We deserve to know that. That's common sense, and make sure that what's happening is not hurting drinking water and property values in northeast Montana. But again, I come back to supporting an energy policy that looks at the long-term future. And in terms of climate change, I'm not afraid to say those words. We need people that want to be part of the solution. That debate is not going away in Washington, D.C. Not people that are going to put their heads in the sand and say that it's not true. I've talked to coal companies. They want people in Congress that want to be part of the solution. This debate is not going away.
Well, I agree that we don't need subsidies across the board. And there is a difference between John and I, because John and I still support, John still supports subsidies for wind. I don't have any problems with wind, I don't have any problems with any alternative energy, but it can't be subsidized when it comes to in the field. Research and development is an appropriate taxpayer's expense, but when it becomes fielded, then it has to live on its own. Rail's a big issue in Montana. I'd rather have pipelines, quite frankly, than move oil by rail. And it's hurting commodities in Montana. It's hurting our principal industry, which is still our commodities, our farmer. So we can talk to Sydney, why can't they move their sugar? Because they don't have the rail, including Plum Creek across the thing. So I think that pipelines we need to support the pipelines, the infrastructure, get that in, move it forward. No subsidies for anybody, and work hard to be energy independent. Thanks.
Mr. Fellows.
Well, that's one thing we don't need to do is subsidize alternative energy. The free market will provide us with that. When gasoline gets so high, that's when you're going to find more wind and you're going to find more solar. We've got the Department of Energy that really produces no energy, so why do we need it? We've got some overlap with the Department of Energy, with the Department of Defense, and I think, in terms of policy, we could probably get rid of the Department of Energy and save the taxpayers some money. I think that's one thing that we can do. We can look at alternative energies, but I think the free market is going to be a lot better at providing a lot of those things. And two, I think, this country, we're losing some of our manufacturing capabilities. We're coming back, but we're going to need some of this energy in the future in case we need it for security reasons and just for economic reasons. And so I think we got to look at our policy that does encompass private property rights, that encompasses new ideas, and that certainly is something that we don't subsidize.
We invest in oil, coal, and natural gas as it is. Why wouldn't we invest in the future? Nobody's saying that wind, biomass, solar, hydro are the answers to all of our energy needs tomorrow. But why wouldn't we invest in it? Just like we invest in early education, just like we invest in research and healthcare. just like we invested to send a man to the moon. Those aren't the answers to all of our energy needs tomorrow, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't invest in a long-term future thinking about our kids and grandkids.
Next question is from Matt Bung. Mr. Fellows will answer first, followed by Mr. Lewis and Mr. Zinke.
Lincoln County has a land base that is comprised of 74% federal ownership. Historically, the management of these forest lands supported a vibrant timber industry that supported thousands of families. Lincoln County now has had every commercial sawmill shuttered except for one small cedar mill in Troy, and it consistently has one of the highest unemployment rates in the state. Can you give us your perspective on what caused the milling infrastructure to collapse and what could be done in Washington to correct it?
Well, I think there's probably a couple of answers to that, mainly because of the downturn of the housing industry. One, we're locking up our forests, so we can't get out the dead and the beetle diseased trees, but I think too, we've got to open up the avenue for more industry. You know, certainly those bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. probably never been east of the Mississippi, so they don't know what's going on here in the state of Montana. It's better to have local control on some of these issues, and if we're going to have a good forest management, those forest management policies can include the timber companies, so we can go in and environmentally harvest some of these trees that we need to. I mean, the housing industry is picking up. I mentioned hemp before. I think hemp is also one of those plants that grows fast, and the timber industry could use some of that in their sawmills, because it certainly is good for pulp, it's good for paper, and like I say, it's good for building material. So there's plenty of certain avenues, and really I think we just got to get Washington out of the equation and send everything back to the state of Montana. I think we can do a better job at trying to manage these local issues than a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.
Can we manage our federal lands better? Absolutely. Too much of our timber is locked up in litigation, and that's why I support reforming the Equal Access to Justice Act. And that was a provision, a law passed in the 1980s to help small guy that is having a dispute with Social Security Administration and can sue the federal government. Unfortunately, the law is being abused today by fringe environmental groups that are trying to stop any timber sale whatsoever from happening. Let's reform that. That's an answer right there. We also need to make sure that we're looking at the Forest Service, BLM, and Fish and Wildlife Parks, and make sure that they're managing those lands the best they can possibly do. And Congress needs to play a role to see what it is that's not working. Unfortunately, Congress isn't doing anything these days. And the American people can see it. That's why Congress has a 9% approval rating. 9%, because they're not working on solutions. Let's look at the Forest Service. And that's how we're going to increase timber and lumber in this country. I support common sense solutions like Senator Tester's Forest Jobs and Recreation Act. That is a bill that was built from the ground up. That's why people like Corey Sanders from Pyramid Lumber and Sherman Anderson from Sun Mountain support those provisions to get logging going again in this country.
Well, John, I agree. We need to look at the Equal Access to Justice Act, but it goes on beyond that. You know, when I grew up, Libby was a double A, and now it's a struggling B, and I've seen what happens when you lose access to timber. And Stoltz Lumber Company, the oldest lumber company in Montana, is laying off folks. Plum Creek, the largest owner in Montana at 900,000 acres, has 3 weeks of logs. Sun Mountain, outside of Deer Lodge, is having to go to Laramie, Wyoming by rail for logs. You look at Lincoln County, the perpetual, or the in perpetuity, the cut rate could be sustained yield of about 350 million board feet a year. 350 million board feet. Today they struggle with getting 10. So some of it is Equal Access to Justice Act, and some is the Forest Service. Our local rangers don't have the power they once did. You know, the power's been sucked up to Washington, where all these decisions are made in Washington. And quite frankly, you know, the view from the Potomac is a lot different than the view from the Flathead. And we have to go back to what we were in the Forest Service, to give the local rangers some authority, make sure the local communities that are impacted this have some say in the process, and make sure the Forest Service doesn't spend all the money on forest fires, doesn't spend the second batch on litigation, and finally, they don't have any money left for forest management. So I think we need to look at the whole process. I agree that Washington and Congress need to step forward. I don't believe that Tester's bill that sunsets the provision of logging is appropriate. There's a lot in it that's good, but there's a lot in it that's not so good either. Thank you.
Mr. Fellows?
Well, I think too, it'd be nice if the timber companies themselves actually had more land they own themselves and better able to harvest their trees and plant new trees. I know that some of the corporations in Montana that left, like the Anaconda Company, when they left Montana, they just went ahead and clear-cutted all their lands and then left, took the money and run. And I think that's the wrong way, that's the wrong attitude that we need to have in terms of public lands and corporations. And I guess in terms of public lands, I guess we all, a lot of people that I know get kind of fed up with the fact that, you know, we buy these lands and then we get locked out of our own public lands. And so I think we need some multiple use. You know, I think we could also have some user fees on some of these lands, certainly to help in some of the management and so on and so forth, and certainly get the timber companies on board with this.
We need more jobs in Lincoln County. I've been to Libby many, many times, but to suggest that all it is that government got in the way of Libby is an insult to the victims of what happened there with W.R. Grace. Been there many, many times. I know, I understand that a lot of people want to move on from what happened and create more good-paying jobs. But some people can't move on. Some people are still suffering from the effects of what happened with W.R. Grace. And I support responsible job development in Lincoln County. Let's do it. There's good examples of it. The Troy Mine, Revette Minerals. That's a responsible company that's supporting over 100 jobs, good-paying jobs in Libby. But it's not. This is a complicated situation. We need more jobs in Lincoln County, but it isn't just as simple as opening timber mills. But we should fight for that.
In many ways, it's not a question of who owns the land. You know, you hear this argument between state and federal. It's a question of how we manage it and how we manage it better. Because clearly the lands are not being managed as well as they could be, and people are suffering as a result. There's a mine in Libby, Montmore, that's waiting to open. It's been 6 years in the AIS, and there's no end in sight. That's 400 jobs in Libby. It doesn't have to do with asbestos. It's just a mine that's already has previous documented mining capability, gold, silver, platinum, and it's being held up, you know, by an EIS that is no end in. So I'm a believer it is fixable, but we're going to have to work together to do it. And you know, when communities suffer, you know, Montana suffer, and really good people, you know, they ruin their life. So.
Next question is from Carol Marino. Mr. Lewis will answer first, followed by Mr. Zinke and Mr. Fellows.
Mr. Lewis, it seems many of the issues that Congress deals with over and over again are polarizing in the extreme. A good example is the debate over gun rights and gun control. Is there any reason to expect or wish Congress to move forward on new legislation that either restricts or protects gun rights? Or is this just an issue that makes for good campaign commercials?
Well, the reason it's being discussed in this campaign in ads is because there's two different records on this. I have an A rating from the NRA, and Montana has a strong tradition of responsible gun ownership. That's true. But I'm being attacked as if I want to take away guns, which just isn't true. And that's by my opponent, Mr. Zinke. And in 2008, he had a 42% rating from the NRA. 42%. So for him to point the finger at me that I'm the one trying to take away guns just doesn't square with the facts. I think that we need to look at the system and keep guns out of the hands of those criminals and people with mental health issues in this country. When I hear about tragedies happening in Connecticut, Colorado, other places around the country, my first question is, what would make somebody turn a gun on innocent people, innocent children? And it makes me wonder how we are addressing mental health care in this country, especially in rural places like Montana, especially for veterans that can't get access to mental health care issues. We're seeing suicide rates higher than we've ever seen. So I want to see us focus on how we address mental health care in this country when it comes to guns.
John, actually, you don't have an A rating. You have an AQ. And that's why David Keene, the president or former president of the NRA, made a commercial on our behalf to tell the truth. The truth is you have an AQ based on questionnaire alone. The truth is you brought Steny Hoyer, who has a 0 NRA rating, around Montana. And when you suggest that the real abbreviation of the NRA is the National Republicans Association, John, that wasn't true. It's the NRA.
I didn't say that.
Go to our website. Go to our website and listen to John Lewis talk about it. Listen to the commercial from the former president of the NRA who was endorsing me, because he knows in Montana I will support our existing gun rights because they're right for Montana. And I will also oppose any outside organization, including the NRA, including any gun organization, that opposes what Montana does with our ammunition and our way of life. Because Montana needs to side, not Washington, D.C.
Well, I'm the only candidate in this race that knows the Second Amendment is not about hunting. The right to keep their arms shall not be infringed. And I think when Zinke says he supports the Second Amendment, he's not being genuine, because he also supports universal background checks. He has more in common with Michael Bloomberg, mayor of New York. He also said that there are certain guns that we shouldn't be able to own. He's also not in favor, he wasn't in favor back then of having guns in national parks. He didn't think that shouldn't have happened, but we have guns in national forests, and there's not a problem. People should be able to carry guns in the national parks as well. We need to eliminate some of these laws that we have on the books. I mean, the Gun Control Act of 1968, which forbid, the look-alike submachine guns from Europe. Well, the Second Amendment, the purpose of that was to defend ourselves from enemies, both foreign and domestic. And so I have a right to defend my property, defend my families, and I have a right to determine which gun I want to use. I mean, if the Second Amendment is only about hunting, we're going to be in a British-style Second Amendment country where, in order to shoot your gun, you got to go to a rod and gun club and check it out for the weekend, and you can shoot it. You can't have it at your home, and I certainly don't think we need to go through all these checks for a right I already have.
Look, my opponent's record is clear on this. I received an A rating. He received a lower grade. I agree with Mr. Fellows. He's the only candidate on this stage who supports background checks. And he filled out a questionnaire with Project Vote Smart that said he supports that. So there's a clear difference in this on gun rights, and I agree with what Mr. Fellows said. Thank you.
Well, I'm probably the only guy in the state who's ever shot a 50 or know the difference between a clip and a magazine. And there are limits on weapons, shoulder-fired weapons, tanks, long-range howitzers. You should get a permit. But I think we can all agree that in Montana, guns are a legacy. It's a legacy that we have to protect. And I think Montana gun laws, as they are today, are appropriate for Montana. And I will defend every law that is on the books today in Montana, because I defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I will continue to do that.
Well, the Second Amendment and the Constitution is very quite clear. The right to keep our arms shall not be infringed, and so we don't need any new laws. We should get rid of some of the laws that we actually have, and I would support that if elected to Congress, because gun owners, they have to keep the rights, because otherwise, why even bother having the Second Amendment? We're going to say, well, we believe in the Second Amendment, except we want this and we want that. We want putting all these different restrictions on it. And in some of the worst places for crime are the places like Washington D.C. and Chicago, Illinois, where you can't own your own guns.
Next question is from Matt Bunk. Mr. Zinke will answer first, followed by Mr. Fellows and Mr. Lewis.
The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has indicated that large-scale cleanup activities are winding down at the Superfund site in Libby and could be finished in as little as 3 years. At that point, the federal government intends to turn over much of the remaining responsibility to the state. If elected, what would you do to ensure that the burden of any remaining asbestos cleanup costs would not fall solely on Montana taxpayers?
Well, as your next congressman, I've asked to sit on natural resources for a reason. One is Montana both has a huge opportunity to develop our natural resources, and we have a lot of cleanup to do, because you do need regulation. I mean, corporations alone, by just asking them to police themselves, has not worked in Montana, and it won't work in the future. So you do need adequate protections to make sure the environment we all live in is promulgated to our future generations. So as your next congressman, I'll make sure that the federal government, the EPA, has the right funding to make sure the job is completed. So Montana doesn't get caught holding the bag. That's fair. And Montana's got a lot of cleanup, including this valley. In Summers, there's a lot of sites that still need work, and quite frankly, the law wasn't the same back then, and I think we have gotten better. And you see a lot of people slam the EPA over everything. Well, the EPA does do good things. Now they've overreached in a lot of areas, particularly our water, but there's a lot of good that the EPA has done and will continue to do. And we want to make sure that at least the regulations are known, they're not arbitrary, and business can look at an environment that is clear, concise, and understandable. Thanks.
Well, I think I support private property rights, and that's, if we have strict private property rights, I think we could help in some of this environmental degradation. And plus, we have the courts as well. But Montana does a very good job because it does require corporations to have a bond, a reclamation bond, to clean up their mess. Nobody wants to have their land polluted on. But a story from the Boston Globe years ago had pointed out that some of the worst polluters in this country were by the federal government. And so that's money that we're paying. We're paying twice. We're paying taxes, and we're paying to clean up that mess as well. And so I think the regulations, we've got to have some common sense regulations. We've got to streamline them, but certainly to protect the private property rights and to make sure that the corporations do clean up their fair share of the messes that they leave behind.
We need to make sure that the cleanup is truly a cleanup, and that includes the people that were affected by the disaster up there with W.R. Grace. That's why a public emergency disaster declaration was declared in that area, the first of its kind in this country. I was proud to work up in Libby and fight for funding for the card clinic up there that's serving over 5,000 families, people, victims of what happened with W.R. Grace. And we need to make sure that that justice is done and the cleanup is done by the EPA in the best way possible. Unfortunately, that emergency disaster declaration up there in Libby, in the health care bill, the health care bill provided health care to all those 5,000 folks that are getting help, that needed help. And in the health care bill, and Mr. Zinke is in favor of getting rid of the health care, which would take away that Medicare service for those victims of asbestos right away, abandon the ship on the health care bill. And that's part of the solution for Libby in making sure that justice is done up there, both with the cleanup and the health care crisis that was created by the W.R. Grace disaster. I also heard earlier, I mentioned the Troy mine, Brevet Minerals. That's a great example of good paying jobs and responsible development there. But I also heard about Montanor and mining in the Cabinet Mountains. And if we're going to do that, that needs to be done in the right way as well. Montanore, though, has one of the worst environmental records of any mining company around. So if we're going to do mining, create good paying jobs, it needs to be done in the right way in Lincoln County.
You know, John, I think we've had more debates in history of any congressional run. It always amazes me that you always decide you're going to talk about what I mean or what I believe. In the case of abandoned ship, I know you haven't served. I do say abandoned ship on Obamacare because it's sinking. But as a naval officer, when you abandon a ship, you don't just jump into the ocean. You go to a lifeboat. My environmental policies are clear. There's a lot of differences between you and I, John, so why don't we point out the differences rather than make things up about what I've said and what I haven't said. If you want to know what I say, then ask me. Because you know what? If you tell the truth, you don't have to remember the lies. And as we get closer to the campaign, the lies become bolder. Right? All Republicans hate children, puppies, elderly. We want to cut Medicare, Medicaid. I'm the guy that's trying to save it, because if we don't save our country and we don't have a prosperous economy here, you know what? The check won't cash. So we all better realize that we're Americans first and stick on the issues.
Well, I think too, another problem we have with corporations and the environment certainly is that we have too much money in politics. I mean, these guys give money to the special interests, they give money to congressmen so they get to vote for them. For their special interests, they weren't using the tax code to pick winners and losers. That's why I gave the example of Solyndra. We talked about the Department of Transportation gave money to different car companies to develop these hybrid cars, but it was companies like Toyota and Honda that didn't take the money that were able to forge products like the Prius and the Insight without all this government money. And so I think that's one of those things that we give all these corporations these massive subsidies just so they can buy themselves freedom from EPA regulations and from Washington influence.
The more debates, the better. That's good for democracy. If voters are subjected to millions of dollars in TV ads and mailings, the least candidates can do is get up and answer some questions for the voters. No, this is not a rapid debate. We've debated a few times. I barely could get him to debate in Billings for the first place on September 29th. The Billings Gazette offered him 17 alternative dates to that one, and none of them worked. Governor Ted Schwinn in the 1980s, in his elections, they debated 35 times. Frank probably remembers, including in Jordan, of all places. Debates are good for democracy, and I heard that lecture about sticking to the issues, but I didn't hear any issues in that lecture. I am sticking to the issues and pointing out the differences in his campaign. Thank you.
Next question comes from Frank Neely. Mr. Fellows will go first, followed by Mr. Lewis and Mr. Zinke.
Thank you. Mr. Fellows, do you think Congress is taking an active enough role in national security? There has been lots of criticism of President Obama's limited approach to fighting ISIS, yet it appears Congress has no interest in writing a declaration of war as the Constitution authorizes it to do so. And when it comes to border security, it appears that Congress has ceded total decision-making authority to the executive branch. Will you fight to strengthen the role of the People's Congress to protect our nation if you're elected? Or do you think the president should have unchecked power as commander-in-chief?
No, I don't support having the president have these unchecked powers, just because Congress is afraid to actually make votes on these things. They don't want to go to Washington, D.C. and have a declaration of war, because then they're going to have to vote yes or no on these issues. It's like Tom Coburn, that once talked about, in terms of cutting government, he said some of the small stuff they don't want to cut because it's useless, but some of the large stuff they don't want to cut because they have to have their name on a yes or no vote. I mean, certainly the ISIS situation is not going to go away, but do we want a prolonged war in Iraq? I don't think we do. We already spent about $17 million so far. We've spent another $20 billion in the Iraq war earlier, and all the Humvees and stuff that we left behind, we're now bombing those things because the Iraqi military can't even defend their own country. So do we want to have more troops on the ground? I don't think the American public wants to have another extended war with all these kinds of billions of dollars, because we're sitting here spending money for schools, bridges and roads overseas for those folks, but we have those same issues, needs over here in this country. And as far as the border, we did pass the Comprehensive Immigration Reform back in '86 under the Reagan administration. And so I think we should just, we need to follow the law and enforce what we have on the books.
The safety of Americans is our #1 priority, and there's no question that ISIS has no regard for human life, and we need to send them to the bottom of the ocean where Osama bin Laden is. We need to do everything we can to stop them. That being said, absolutely Congress should play its constitutional role to authorize force and debate this issue. We need to know how much it's going to cost. After a decade of nation building in Iraq, let's not make the same mistakes that we've been making for the last 10 years. We spent over $2 trillion in Iraq alone. A big reason that we find ourselves in the fiscal situation today is because we've been at war since 2001, and Congress needs to debate this issue. And the issue of border security, that points to how complicated this situation is. They estimate there's about 2 billion Islamic or people, Muslims in the world, 2 billion. And out of that billion, 15% or so are Islamic extremists, they say. Well, that is hundreds of millions of Islamic extremists in the world. It isn't as complicated as just bombing our way out of the situation in Iraq and Syria. And so we need to look at border security. It's very, very complicated. If you are an extremist with ISIS, you're going to look probably at the northern border of the United States. We've got a big northern border right here in Montana. And so it's a complicated situation. I want to see us debate the issue in Congress. I want to know how much it's going to cost, and we need to have an objective to what we're doing.
Well, ISIS is a threat to all of us sitting in this room. If you don't think ISIS is here, ask the graduate from Great Falls High who had her head severed in Oklahoma. ISIS is here. And it's not that complicated to shut our border down. A great country like ours that could build the Panama Canal in the 19th century certainly is capable of building a fence today. It's not that complicated. It's not complicated to show leadership abroad, where if the United States does not lead, that void vacuum is filled by forces that are adversary to us. And when we don't lead, that's exactly what's happening overseas. ISIS is on full throttle, and we're on full retreat. Because we've had multiple times to check ISIS, and we have done nothing. We had multiple times to give aid, the Thai, in Glen, in Benghazi, and did nothing for 7 hours. Our country does nothing in the last 6 years, and it shows. And we either lead by example, and remember John F. Kennedy, we will pay any price and bear any burden to ensure the security of liberty. And unfortunately, ISIS is going to take another burden to pay. And no one understands it more than I do. And I wish it wasn't true. I wish you could bomb your way out of it. But you can't. And we have to lead because no one else on this planet is capable of it.
Well, national security is definitely important, but sometimes we get ourselves into a lot of trouble. We gave the Libyan rebels, the freedom fighters, arms and money to help topple, I can't think of the guy's name, the dictator there. Now, but what have we got now? We've got a civil war amongst those two fighting factions trying to keep control of the country. We're seeing the same thing in Iraq with the Sunnis and the Kurds and all the other religious factions, and it's just not going to work. We're not going to be able to control those countries, but I think in terms of national defense, we have to certainly follow our Constitution and get rid of some of these unconstitutional laws like the Patriot Act and like the National Authorization Defense Act. Certainly there's a case in Connecticut where the FBI went to a bookseller and she told her partner, and now they were brought up on charges because of the Patriot Act. That's something we got to eliminate.
Mr. Lewis?
When I travel around Montana and talk to folks, people are very wary about the idea of us getting involved in another endless war. They are. Montanans have served as higher rate as any state in the country. And so I am not going to be somebody that's going to instantly react to these situations by calling for sending in the use of force. When the president announced that he was going to authorize airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, Mr. Zinke immediately said that that's not enough, we need to send in ground troops. I don't think that's the answer to every single one of these situations that happens around the world. We need to focus on the issues and problems we have at home and stop policing the world every time a situation starts around the world.
With great power comes great responsibility. It's not just me. General Conway, four-star Marine, former Commandant of the Marine Corps, said as much. When our president elected to do air operations, I quote General Conway, "There isn't a snowball's chance in hell it'll be effective." And it won't be, because we've seen it's not effective. Today they have M1A1 tanks, Bradleys, chemical weapons. They're training pilots with MiGs, 21, 23s. There's 20 aircraft that are missing from Liberia. These aircraft are capable of being loaded with chemical weapons and striking us. So if you don't think ISIS is a threat, you're wrong. It needs to be addressed. Do I want to spend, my time, my children, our resources in Iraq? No. But do we have to? Yes.
Next question is from Matt Bunk. Mr. Lewis will go first, followed by Mr. Zinke and Mr. Fellows.
Various ideas for amending the Constitution currently being proposed include changing the First Amendment to let Congress regulate campaign speech, changing the rules on birthright citizenship, changing the Second Amendment to allow more restrictions on guns, and changing the rules for election of senators and representatives to allow term limits. What proposals, if any, do you support for changing the Constitution?
Good question, Matt. One of them would be amending the Constitution to overturn the Citizens United decision in this country. There's no question in my mind that what ails our political system and the government is too much money in politics. Too much money. And it's made worse by Citizens United. No question about that. That has meant more money in our political system, more money in campaigns, and a constant campaign. We need to overturn Citizens United. Thank you.
Well, I don't think we need to change the Constitution. I think we need to adhere to it. But I agree with money. And in our campaign, we had great support. I had also had 22,000 donors that donated on average $35 or less. With that is a great responsibility to do what I say I'm going to do. I've said a lot of things in the campaign, but I'm truthful. And you know what? Is that you and I may agree or disagree, but I'll never tell you something I don't mean, and I do listen. And I've been wrong before, as all of us have in this room. But if a congressman doesn't listen and shuts his ears and says, you know what, I got it right, we're not doing our job. And so it's okay to listen. And maybe your facts are better than mine, but prove it. Prove it with passion, prove it with facts. Because if your facts are better than mine, I will listen. And should I win and be your next congressman, the first people I'm going to talk to are those that didn't vote for me. I already have the people that voted for me, their confidence, but I need everyone's comments in Montana, because a naval officer, I didn't look through a red or blue lens. I've always looked through a red, white, and blue lens, and there's a difference.
Well, I do support the Constitution as is. I don't think we need these amendments. While there may be too much money in politics, what we need to really do is get a smaller government, lower the taxes, and more liberty to get some of that special interest money out of politics in the first place. You know, as one of our presidential candidates, Harry Brown, once said, if we shrink government so small, there won't be any favors to give, so there won't be all this money injected into politics. And that's one thing. I think the Second Amendment ought to stay the same. I think we need to get rid of some of these unconstitutional laws. I think we need to restore the Fourth. I mean, certainly the Fourth is important against unreasonable searches and seizures. I mean, with the Patriot Act, especially with Section 215, that gave the government blank authority to collect all our email and cell phone records, I think is wrong in that regards. I appreciate the Sixth Amendment, trial by jury, because I think, you know, after the ballot box and after maybe the cartridge box, we have the jury box, because juries play a pretty important part in our history, because the Founding Fathers saw juries as a way to keep a check on abusive government. And so juries do have the right to vote their conscience and judge the law. So that's one way we can keep track of those guys in Washington, D.C., because if they pass laws and juries aren't going to support those things in court cases, then Congress has to come back and change those laws. And so we really need to protect our free speech. We need to protect our Fourth Amendment rights and protect our gun rights.
I don't know if it's red, white, and blue lenses or rose-colored glasses. Here's the facts about money in this race. Over 75% of the money we've raised in this race has come from Montana contributors. I heard Mr. Zinke be proud about the statement, or the haul of money that he had, mostly from out of state, from places like Florida, Texas, California. That's a huge difference in this race. Another thing that Citizens United did, that I come back to Citizens United, we need to change. Mr. Zinke is the only person that I know of that started a super PAC because of Citizens United to attack political opponents. Then he was chairman of the super PAC, and then a few weeks before becoming a candidate, he stepped down as the chairman of that super PAC, only to become a candidate and have the super PAC run ads on his behalf. If I don't know a revolving door, I don't know what one is. That's what happens when you have things like Citizens United, a corruption of the system, and it's got to stop.
You know, facts are funny things, John. Is that about a third of your money comes from PACs. About another third comes from Act Blue, which I challenge you to go on Act Blue, on the FEC report, and take a look at where those donors in Act Blue are. They're not there on the report. So I don't apologize for having 25,000 donors. I don't apologize for having donors across Montana from every county and almost every state, because the issues that we face are more than just Montana. The issues we face are also national issues. And if you have a platform, you're a former Navy SEAL, and you're a veteran, and yes, I'm proud of the job I did with the Super PAC, and there isn't one thing I did wrong for supporting Governor Romney as the President of the United States. I'm sorry. I think I can really make a good president.
Of course, I guess if you think there shouldn't be any money in politics, then vote for Mike Fellows. How many people in here have ever heard of a guy with the name of Harry Greenwell? Well, that was a name that Ben Franklin had to use in the Revolution, during revolutionary times, because British had a tax, and they also had a permit that you had to have for the printing press. And so the Founding Fathers had to go ahead and have different synonyms just to print out their views of freedom and getting government out of our life from the British Empire. And I think that we need, I think with things like Citizens United, corporations and myself, I want to say something about a candidate that should be able to do that. And I think if we limit free speech, we're going to get into more trouble. And so I go back to the issue of Harry Greenwell and say, yeah, we should support Ben Franklin.
Next question is from Frank Neely with Mr. Zinke first, followed by Mr. Fellows and Mr. Lewis.
There are obviously very large differences between all the parties represented on stage. Given that and the sometimes large argumentative nature of your campaign commercials and your debates on stage, how are you supposed to govern together, supposing you were both elected to Congress? And I'm using this as an example to talk about the issue of compromise. I know the editorial board of the Daily Interlake has on many occasions talked about the question of compromise in Congress and when it's appropriate to do so and when it should be avoided, including the issue of raising the debt ceiling. Can you give us one example of an issue on which you believe your party needs to compromise and hasn't, and one example of an issue where your party needs to stand for principle and has done so inadequately? Mr. Fellows, if you wish, you may address this without reference to your own party, since it is not in power.
Well, Frank, I think the Republican Party needs to evolve from a party of no to a party of go. The Republican Party has to move forward and create a vision for what we're going to do in the top 5 issues of this country. And not only that, we have to articulate that vision, and our vision has to be a better alternative than what we have today. That doesn't mean Obamacare. All right, I think it's sinking. That doesn't mean that we should have no health care at all. Because remember, the promise was what? You'd be able to keep your doctor, keep your insurance, and the goal was accessible health care, affordable health care, quality health care. So does it mean that one party develops a bill and says, you know what, sorry, we got it? No. It's going to take both parties to do what we're supposed to do, is put our country first. Our country before party. And I've said all along, is I'm American first. And where you are on the political spectrum, for some, I'm just not conservative enough. And for others, I'm way too conservative. For Montana, I think I'm just about right. I'll listen. I care, and I'm an American first.
Well, I can say we don't need any more moderates in Congress. I think those are some of the folks that are giving us problems. You know, John McCain's a moderate. I think Ryan Zinke probably has more in common with John McCain than he does with somebody like Justin Ames, who I think is a very good libertarian-oriented representative from Michigan. The Libertarian Party certainly want to see a smaller government, maximum freedom, less taxes, and more individual liberty, because I think everybody has their own idea of what liberty actually is and freedom. I mean, some people talk about supporting liberty and freedom, but sometimes it's out of a George Orwell book, Animal Farm, that, oh, we'll have freedom, but some will have more freedom than others. We have to give freedom to even those that we may disagree with, as long as they want to live in a peaceful society and not infringe on the rights of other neighbors. As far as compromise, there's probably some things that we don't need to really compromise on. You know, if we have to compromise, I guess I'd rather compromise in the right direction. You know, if I got elected to Congress, I guess I'd be a caucus of one representing more liberty and less government. Because certainly the two major parties they don't really care about us, the citizens. All they care about is who has the most members of Congress, but things stay the same. You know, they can argue all they want in Congress, but afterwards you'll probably see them down at the Capitol Hill bar drinking beers together, because they're all good friends, and they're going to screw us over one way or another, unless we get somebody different in there.
I think compromise is a pretty good word. I think a much better word is cooperation. With compromise, that's people giving up, everybody giving up something, and sometimes that means giving up your principles. Cooperation, I think, is a much better word. People coming together for the greater good. And there's many, many issues that we can come together and cooperate on that affect western states like Montana. Think about it. Investing in education, investing in infrastructure, investing in workforce development. Those are the issues that we can get both parties start working again. In terms of issues that I'm going to stand on principle on, it's protecting Medicare and Social Security in this country. 1 in 5 Montanans enjoys the benefits of Medicare and Social Security. You paid into the system, you should get those benefits. And I come back to the issue when we were talking about timber and Equal Access to Justice Act. I think that my party can give a little when it comes to environmental regulation. And that Equal Access to Justice Act is an example where it's being abused and not allowing any timber development whatsoever because of lawsuits. There are ways that our party can give and provide more responsible development in Montana and the country.
I think what you do not compromise is your values. You don't compromise your principles. But you do compromise on a bill based on common interests. You may not get everything you want, but as long as I think you move the ball to the field, that's what needs to happen in D.C. We have to show movement, something. But this gridlock is frustrating and it's not serving its purpose, and people are upset. You should be, because nothing's getting done. And when things don't get done, that means America doesn't move forward. That means someone else does. And our principles then are at risk. So I do think you should look at what's in common and focus on that. And if we do, then you know what? The ball will move up the field. Tomorrow will be a better day. And America will be the 21st century what it was last century. Thank you.
Well, we certainly need better leadership in Washington, D.C. I know John Boehner came as Whitefish to support Ryan Zinke, but his idea of compromise was passing a clean debt ceiling bill and essentially gave President Obama a blank check to spend anything he wanted to. And so for a political party like the Republicans that always want to talk about less government and lower taxes, once they get into office, it just certainly doesn't happen. We can say the same thing about the Democrats. They certainly want to see things increase. And I think in terms of some of the reforms in Congress that we've put together, I think we need a singles bill act so that when these bills go up before Congress, if they stand on their own, they're not inserted in some spending bill so they get elected or so they get passed. I mean, the Real ID Act was inserted into a bill, certainly so it get passed, but otherwise it would never stand on its own. And I think plus Congress should read their own bills, but they don't read what they're passing, and I think that's a travesty.
I talked to a sitting congressman just the other day, and he told me the most frustrating thing about serving in Congress today is that everyone there virtually knows the solutions on many of these issues, whether it's energy development, immigration, healthcare, what we need to do, the deficit. But when it comes down to it, in the votes, no one is willing to take the votes to do what's right. That's why Congress has a 9% approval rating. The American people can see it. When I read that poll that Congress has a 9% approval rating, they also asked about cockroaches and root canals. Those polled higher than Congress at 9%. Root canals, 11%. We can do better than that. We've got to get Congress working together again on issues. And to me, I come back to Citizens United. The reason people don't do what's right and vote right is because of money in politics, because it's a constant campaign and it's about getting reelected rather than doing what's right and voting the right way for the American people.
Final questions from Carol Marino. Mr. Fellows first, followed by Mr. Lewis and Mr. Zinke.
Mr. Fellows, our local population includes a large percentage of retirees. Thinking of them, can you elaborate on how the nation's safety net is working in the form of Social Security, Medicare, and the Affordable Care Act, and whether you think massive changes are going to be needed to keep any or all of these programs viable in the coming years?
Well, I think we're actually going to have problems with Social Security and Medicare because they are going broke. You know, it used to be we had about 18 people working for one retiree. Now you have about 4 people working for one retiree. So the system is certainly going broke. I know when former Governor Gary Johnson of New Mexico, our 2012 Libertarian presidential candidate, talked about Medicare. He thought it would have been easier if the states had a block grant free of all the strings attached, and he could find a better way to keep the safety net going than he could from those bureaucrats back in Washington, D.C. We could certainly get rid of some of those bureaucrats in D.C. as well. And I think there's certainly problems with the Affordable Care Act. I mean, it's not really that affordable. There's a lot of, many people that lost their insurance. I know some of the nonprofit boards that I serve on, we're now paying more, $15,000 more just for insurance. A lot of doctors are upset too because they had personal relationships with some of these patients, but because they had to switch insurance providers, some of their insurance providers, they aren't in their the doctor's provider network, so they lose their patients. So I think Obamacare can't be really fixed. It's got to be overhauled. We need to find some more free market situations that will help the healthcare of people in this country.
I think everyone agrees we need to do something about deficit in our debt. And it's about priorities. I come back to our discussion about being at war. I believe that that's a big reason we're in the fiscal situation that we're in. And we need to balance the budget. Step number one, Congress hasn't passed a budget themselves in over 1,000 days. They need to get their house in order very quickly. It's about priorities. What I don't support is balancing the budget on the backs of seniors, working families, veterans in this country. Medicare, Social Security. Social Security, for one, is solvent until 2033. We need to make it more solvent beyond that, but that's not where we should look for cuts to balance the budget. I've been attacked over and over in this campaign that I somehow supported cuts to Medicare. I want to clear that up. I want to talk some truth on Medicare very quickly. And that's that there's this false thing being said that $716 billion was cut from Medicare in the Affordable Care Act. $716 billion. There were no cuts to senior benefits in the Affordable Care Act. Those cuts were to waste and fraud in the system and unwarranted subsidies to insurance companies that wasn't making anybody healthier. And in fact, those cuts to the waste and fraud in the system extended the life of the Medicare Trust Fund to the year 2024. The Affordable Care Act strengthened Medicare, not made Medicare worse. It's about priorities, and we need to grow the economy, we need to cut out wasteful spending, and we need to quit policing the world. Thank you.
Well, Montana does have an aging demographic. And we had to have a prosperous economy in order to keep our promises. I mean, that's it. And so we've made a lot of promises. We made a lot of promises to the veterans. We made a lot of promises to Social Security, Medicare. Oh, and by the way, Governor Romney did say that Obamacare cut $720 billion from Medicare and transferred it to Obamacare. So you can believe John Lewis or you can believe Governor Romney. But it is about keeping our promises. And I'm the last person that wants to cut Social Security, but I did talk to the Mercatus Institute and looked at the program. And what's wrong and what's right with Social Security? If Social Security was an earned benefit through time, and all of you that we are feed into the system, if that was the only part of Social Security, it would be valid and solvent forever. But Social Security has become also disability. And Congress can't keep from putting their little hands in the cookie jar. And so Congress uses, the surplus for Social Security at will. And so I think Social Security needs to go back to what is intended, make sure that the check clears. We make sure that we have Medicare Part D shored up in perpetuity, and Congress has to balance the budget in 10 years. I think balancing the budget in 10 years is reasonable for a great country.
Well, first off, we'll never get the budget balanced. In 10 years, the Ryan plan that that Ryan wants to talk about still spends 3 to 6% a year. And by the time 2024 hits around, we're still going to have over $1 trillion worth of debt. And so it doesn't work out. And plus, Obamacare was patterned after Romney Care. Massachusetts, Romney supported Romney Care, and their initial health care costs were pretty low, and they decided in the actual costs are a lot more than what they intended. So we're never going to get health care under cost. And I think the problems with some of the Affordable Care Act is we're forcing some of these folks that had insurance onto Medicaid rolls. And they can't get good insurance, or they can't get good care in some of those cases. And so you see them go to emergency rooms because it takes months to get appointments to see the doctors, where if they had their own insurance, they were much better off.
Thank you for pointing that out. Again, on Medicare, I get to point out that both Ryan Zinke and Mitt Romney are wrong on whether I cut Medicare. Those same cuts, that's 700, I guess it's 20 billion now, 720 billion, are the same cuts included in the Paul Ryan budget. The Paul Ryan budget, supported by Mr. Zinke. Those same cuts. But now he's saying, and Governor Mitt Romney, that we cut Medicare, even though Paul Ryan included those to extend the life of the Medicare Trust Fund. So please, listen to me on this. There were no cuts to Medicare and senior benefits in the Affordable Care Act. And it always amazes me when somebody like Governor Mitt Romney, who basically created the framework for the Affordable Care Act when he was governor of Massachusetts, that Mr. Fellows just pointed out. But now, when it's politically convenient, he's totally opposed to those reforms to the healthcare system. All of this disguises the fact that we need to do something about the millions of uninsured Americans in this country.
Well, I wish Governor Romney was here tonight, but he's not. And it's not the Ryan Zinke budget, it's the Paul Ryan budget. And what I agree with it is it's a framework, and at least someone had the courage to look at a budget and go line by line and say, this is a framework, a draft, how to balance the budget. Someone had the courage in Congress to do that. Because it's not easy, because you're going to get hit on every line. And do I agree on every line? Absolutely not. Do I agree on cutting Medicare, Social Security? Absolutely not, because that's a promise we made. So we're going to keep the promise. But what I like is someone had the courage in Congress to go, you know what? This is a framework of how to balance the budget in 10 years. Now, this is a starting point to discussion of how to do it. But I think 10 years is appropriate to address an $18 trillion debt. You can't hide from it. It's $18 trillion. So let's be American and look at it. 10 years seems appropriate to me. Thank you.
We'll now have closing remarks. Mr. Fellows will go first, followed by Mr. Lewis and Mr. Zinke. Each candidate has 3 minutes.
I want to first thank Flathead Valley County Community College for the use of the venue, and thank the Daily Interlake for their participation, and thank the candidates and you as well. It's been a nice, interesting evening, but I think this country is in trouble. I mean, we've got the big money interests are trying to buy this country, and we're going downhill, and sometimes it doesn't make any difference whether it's Republicans or Democrats in charge, because we still see the same problems. I mean, after 1994 with the Republican Revolution, they just said, give us the Senate, we'll change things. Well, nothing changed. Give us the president, we'll change things. Well, from 2000 to 2007, they had plenty of time to reduce the budget to lower taxes, but that didn't happen. We saw spending increase. We saw the debt continually increase. And so I think we need people in Congress that will work for more liberty and less government. And that's people like Mike Fellows. I mean, certainly we've got a war on the Constitution, and that needs to be changed. We need to reform restore the Fourth Amendment. We need to protect our privacy rights. We need to make sure that our gun rights aren't disappeared because because the Second Amendment protects all the other amendments. We need to protect our right to free speech, because without free speech, we're mainly nothing. I think it's nice that I can be able to speak my piece on here too, but I mean, we certainly need candidates that won't waffle on the issues. I mean, Chuck Johnson of the Lee Enterprise in a radio interview said that Fellows was the only candidate that didn't waffle on his issues all the time. When I get to Washington, D.C., I'll vote for more liberty and less government. You won't see me changing my views just to suit the various audiences that I come in front of. And so we do need to work for smaller government, less taxes, and more liberty, because like I mentioned before, you have to give liberty to even to those folks that you may disagree with, because after all, that's what this notion of liberty is. There's lots of things that we may disagree with, but it's all about tolerance and non-aggression. You know, libertarians certainly are tolerant in a lot of things that we tend to support, but it's not because we think that people ought to be able to do these things, but in a free society, we say, look, you know, as long as you're not infringing on your neighbor's rights, we say fine. And I think if you elect the libertarians to office, we're going to start changing some of those things, because as of right now, you know, it's just kind of a war between the two political parties, and they don't really care how much disruption they cause, but it's all about, you know, we got the majority, so that's all that really matters, and we're happy with that. And I think things need to change, and I think if you'll support me with your vote come November, then I'll certainly work on those issues of more liberty and less government. Thank you.
Mr. Lewis.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to our panel, Frank, Carol, and Matt. Tonight, you've seen a clear choice about how we would approach issues. You've seen a contrast between consistent positions and multiple choice positions. We just heard on the Ryan budget, it supports a framework of the Ryan budget, but not certain pieces of it. Well, that's a rounding error. Then it doesn't work. It doesn't work. You can't pick and choose what you support in a budget like that. My mom, professional facilitator, taught me about the words compromise and cooperation. My mom taught me that. Compromise, that's a pretty good word. Cooperation, that's a much better word. The process of working together for the greater good. And that's what's needed in Congress today more than ever. People that truly are willing to work with both sides. And in so many issues, we need people that have solid principles and are truly committed to cooperation. But people have to know where you stand. That's why you'll never see me waffle on positions where cooperation is essential. You'll never see me waffle when it comes to protecting our public lands, like the North Fork. I'll never waffle on that. You'll never see me waffle when it comes to protecting Medicare and Social Security. And you'll never see me waffle when it comes to women making their own health care decisions in this country. I respectfully ask for your vote, and I thank you for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Well, I think this race is about choices too. I think it is big government, little government, and no government. So, it makes a choice. But I think the 21st century can and will be an American century. I do. And I wouldn't run if I didn't believe in America. I wouldn't run if I didn't believe in you. I toured around Montana, and there's been good and bad in the campaign, but what's really been good is Montanans are really super people. We're honest, we're hardworking, we love our families, we want to make sure the legacy that we inherited is the same. And our campaign's hasn't waffled, it's been the same three things from day one. Number one, we got to get government out of business in places it shouldn't be. It doesn't mean we don't need some government, some regulation, but the strength of America is to innovate, to think out of the box. We're not competitive. It is about energy independence in this country, to bring back manufacturing and to make sure we're not held hostage by foreign entities for our basic energy needs. It's already 20% higher to manufacture in the United States, and we're not going to pay our people what we pay Chinese, nor should we, because in Montana you need a 40-hour work week with benefits. It is hard enough to make a living here. and I understand that. But bringing energy independence to bear will make sure that manufacturing remains in this country number one, and also will make sure that we don't have to send our kids overseas to fight for foreign oil when we have it here. And last is about trust. Because if I ask the poll how many of you trust the United States government, I tell you, not many hands would come up. As a former Navy SEAL and a veteran, I've been to a lot of countries in my life, and I've fought in a lot of them. And I can tell you what happens when a people no longer trust their government. That's Africa. It's the Middle East. But it should never be in America.
More about the military.
To restore trust, we have to restore accountability. That means we have to hold everyone accountable for their actions, and what they say, we have to hold them accountable for what they do. And that includes me. I ask for your vote and your prayers. And I ask you most importantly to hold me accountable, because I intend to hold the administration accountable, the Republican Party accountable, the Democratic Party accountable, the Tea Party, the establishment, whatever label we put on ourselves, I intend to hold America accountable so we can be prosperous again. Thank you.